Rome was asleep. The weathered rooftops, worn down by centuries of history, shimmered faintly under the flickering torchlight that fought against the chilly night winds. Narrow alleyways, echoing with distant footsteps, held the secrets of saints and sinners, of martyrs and princes. It was the 16th century, and under the weight of both its glory and its misery, the holy city groaned, crowned with gold, yet corroded from within. It was a Rome in moral ruins, dazzling with the splendor of cardinal palaces, while its barefoot children wandered abandoned in the streets. And it was precisely in this Rome, cradle of emperors and tomb of apostles, that heaven chose to spark an unexpected flame, a fire that did not burn, but melted the hardest of hearts. It didn't rise from a throne or a grand pulpit, but from a dark corner, hidden among simple laughter and secret acts of penance. The bearer of this fire wore no purple robes, held no scepter, and never sought fame. His name was Philip. His cassock was always wrinkled, his walk was light and unassuming, and his soul simply too big to fit inside his chest. Those who knew him described him as an ordinary man, cheerful to the point of silliness, a jokester who often left people puzzled. But when he spoke of God's love, his eyes would blaze, and his heart, quite literally, would beat with such force that it shook his entire body. There was a mystery in him that could disarm the proud and embrace the desperate. Artists and beggars, nobles and sinners alike, could not resist the contagious holiness woven from his tenderness, humor, and prayer. He was the priest who laughed with children, who gently laid his hands on the heads of the sick, who stripped himself of pride through absurd acts of penance. The confessor who converted souls with a smile, the mystic who lived among the people, the madman of God who turned down the red cardinal's hat just so he could remain the father of all. And when his heart, enlarged by a love too vast to be contained, finally stopped one May morning, all of Rome knew it had lost a saint and gained an eternal intercessor. This is the story of Saint Philip Neri, the apostle of joy, the master of divine tenderness, the man whose heart beat so wildly for God that even his body could no longer contain it. A true story woven with quiet miracles and sacred laughter, hidden tears and rescued souls, a story that, even today, continues to set hearts on fire. Florence, in the year of our Lord 1515. The air smelled of tanned leather, open books, and freshly baked bread. The bells of San Giovanni marked the passage of time in a city where art and faith still wrestled with politics over who should rule the soul of man. In a modest yet orderly home, nestled among stone alleys and ochre facades, a boy was born. A boy with lively eyes and an irrepressible smile. His name was Philip. No one could have imagined then that this child would one day change the spiritual face of Rome through laughter. His mother, Lucrezia da Mosciano, was pious and gentle. His father, Francesco Neri, known as Galeotto, was a notary, a just man, more drawn to his books than to affections. Yet from an early age, Philip seemed to follow no law but that of the heart. He laughed at odd times, darted between the pews of the church, and asked questions that made adults squirm. "Mama," he asked one afternoon while playing with pebbles in the courtyard, "does God laugh too?" "And what do you think, my son?" she replied gently. "I think he does, because if he gave me laughter, he must have it too." Lucrezia would embrace him and smile, but deep inside, she knew this son of hers was no ordinary child. His sensitivity was like a finely tuned string. It vibrated with beauty, shuddered at suffering, and burned with passion whenever he heard about heaven. From his earliest days, Philip showed spontaneous devotion. He would go alone to church, gazing at the tabernacle as if waiting for an answer, and speak to God as one talks to an invisible friend. At 8 years old, Tragedy struck his childhood. His mother, suddenly taken ill, passed away, leaving an irreplaceable void at home. Silence fell over the household. Yet Philip, instead of closing himself off in sorrow, transformed it. He became smaller, quieter, but his eyes shone with a new, unfamiliar tenderness. He spent long hours in a nearby chapel, hands clasped, lips barely moving. "What are you doing in there for so long, Philip?" a curious neighbor once asked. "Nothing," the boy answered. "I'm just telling Jesus things, and he listens. Sometimes I think he even answers me." His father, now widowed and ever more absorbed in his books, eventually decided to send Philip to San Germano, where an uncle, a prosperous merchant, could offer him a more secure future. The farewell was quiet. Philip kissed his father's forehead and walked alone to the cart that would carry him away from Florence. He brought with him only a satchel, a wooden cross, and a joy no earthly hardship could strip from him. In San Germano, at the foot of the great monastery of Monte Cassino, Philip learned the art of commerce. But something inside him resisted. He helped in the warehouse, kept accounts, sold grain, but at night he would climb the mountain alone and talk to the stars. Sometimes he sat in silence, other times he laughed at the sky as if someone up there was telling him jokes. "Boy," his uncle said, puzzled, "why don't you care about the business? You could be rich." Philip looked at him with disarming sweetness. "And why would I want to be rich when I already have God?" For 2 years, he lived between ledgers and dreams, until one day, without warning, without money, with nothing but the fire burning in his heart, he set off for Rome. He was 18. No one was waiting for him. No one knew him, but he knew he had to go. "Why are you going to Rome?" the carter asked, giving him a lift partway. "I don't know," Philip replied, his eyes shining. "But I believe my joy is waiting for me there." And with that quiet, determined step, a story began that would shake the very structures of the church. Not through confrontation, but by sheer contagion. A story where grace would not thunder down in judgment, but ripple out through laughter, hugs, and hearts transformed by a holiness so simple. It seemed impossible. The eternal city was waiting, and the Florentine boy, with a heart too big for his chest, was about to set it aflame with a fire no one could see, but that burned within him all the same. Rome, 1533. A city of glorious ruins and broken souls, where the marble of ancient temples stood side by side with the dust of nameless alleyways. The seat of the popes, the cradle of Christendom, was then a tarnished mirror, reflecting the divine, yet fogged by sin, corruption, and despair. The splendor of the Renaissance glowed in its frescoes and palaces, but not in the hearts of its people. It was into this city of contrasts that Philip arrived, carrying nothing but his blazing faith and a heart that seemed to beat for two. At 18, thin, clad in a borrowed tunic and worn sandals, he vanished into the throngs of pilgrims, beggars, nobles, and soldiers that filled the eternal city. No one was waiting for him. No one knew his name. And yet God had already chosen him to light up the city with an invisible flame. In those early days, Philip survived on charity. He slept in a bare attic, ate hardened bread, and earned a few coins by teaching artisans' children to read. His life was simple, hidden. But every night, after finishing his daily work, he descended into the Roman underground. He wandered into the catacombs of San Sebastiano, where the early martyrs had once prayed, lived, and died for Christ. There, in the cold dampness of the stone tunnels, Philip found what no temple could offer, the living silence of eternity. He lit a small oil lamp and sat alone among anonymous tombs to speak with his Lord. It was prayer, yes, but also dialogue, an intimate, burning conversation with no masks. One night, as he prayed on his knees, arms outstretched, A brilliant light filled the corridor. It wasn't an external vision, but something blazing within him. A ball of invisible fire, he would later say, entered through his mouth and descended into his chest. In that instant, his heart swelled with such force he thought he might die of love. "Enough, Lord," he whispered, gasping in ecstasy. "I can't take any more. Your sweetness is killing me." He trembled. His entire body shook like a branch caught in a sacred wind. He fell to the ground, conscious but unable to move, as if his soul had been lifted away from the earthly realm into a moment of pure heaven. From that night on, something inside him was forever changed, literally. Decades later, when his body was examined after death, doctors discovered that his heart had physically enlarged, and 2 ribs had shifted to make room. But at the time, Philip explained nothing. He simply smiled tenderly, rose from the damp stone floor, and climbed back up to the noise of the city. He walked among the merchants in Piazza Navona, the laundresses by the Tiber, and the beggars of Trastevere, as if returning from a secret feast with God. "Why are you always so joyful, Philip?" a young student asked, seeing him day after day at San Girolamo Church. "Because I've just been with the one who never stops loving me," Philip answered, his eyes shining. Without ordination, without an official post, without titles, Philip began an informal apostolate that would transform Rome. He spoke to one person on a street corner, another in a butcher shop, another on the church steps. He didn't preach loudly but loved patiently. He didn't scold but asked, listened, cared. "Do you pray? Have you confessed lately? Do you know that Jesus is waiting for you?" And then, a joke, a laugh, a gentle tap on the shoulder, and after the laughter, a seed, and after the seed, a conversion. In those quiet years, Rome still didn't realize that the madman of God was walking among its ancient stones. But people were starting to notice. There was something different shining in that young man with the scruffy beard and simple cassock. Some mocked him, others avoided him. But many began to change. One afternoon, one of his pupils asked, "Master Philip, why don't you ever tire of telling people the same things over and over?" And Philip, smiling, replied, "Because Christ never tires of calling them." And so, day after day, night after night, prayer after prayer in the belly of Rome, Philip became a burning torch. A humble torch, yes, but so real that its fire still lights hearts today. The heart of the young Florentine was aflame, and for now it burned in secret, but not for much longer. Rome, 1551. Philip was 36 years old. For nearly 2 decades, he had lived as a consecrated layman, hidden among ordinary people, quietly sowing the gospel among cobblers, soldiers, and courtiers. But now, out of obedience, always out of obedience, he had accepted what he had avoided for years: the priesthood. "Are you sure about this, Philip?" an old friend asked him before his ordination. "You're already doing more good than many priests." Philip, with that disarming smile that melted even the most skeptical, replied, "They've asked me out of love, and how could I refuse love?" On the day of his ordination, there was no grand procession, no music, no flowers, just a black cassock that was slightly too short, a trembling voice making promises of obedience, and a heart burning like a lit torch. From that day forward, Philip began to hear confessions, and he never stopped. For hours, days, years. He sat in his confessional and listened, and while he listened, his soul embraced each penitent with a supernatural tenderness. He didn't condemn, he didn't shout, he didn't lecture. He simply gazed with gentleness, touched the wounded soul with firm care, and lifted it with words that seemed whispered straight from heaven. "Do you feel filthy?" he once said to a trembling young male prostitute. "Then let yourself be washed. Christ wants to embrace you even more than you want to run from him." "Father, a woman sobbed during confession. "I can't even pray anymore. I feel nothing." "Then pray without feeling," Philip replied softly. "God doesn't want your excitement. He wants your faithfulness. He has known the silence too." The lines to confess with him began at dawn. Philip rose before anyone, celebrated Mass, trembling with emotion, and then gave himself to each soul as if it were the only one in the world. It was during these days that the Oratory was born, not as an institution, but as a gathering. A small room beside the church of San Girolamo, where young people, children, beggars, and nobles would gather. There they read the lives of the saints, sang psalms, prayed, and laughed. Yes, laughed, because Philip taught that holiness wasn't about long faces, but about deep joy. "Not sinning is good," he once said while tossing an orange in the air, "but loving is better." One day, one of the young people from the Oratory asked him, "Father Philip, how do we know if we're on the right path?" And without stopping his playful antics, he answered, "If you keep laughing with a clean heart, you're on the right path." The Oratory grew like fire, not through structure, but through warmth. Hearts were set ablaze. Some converted, others returned to the fold, and many simply wept at feeling, for the first time, that they were being looked at with mercy. Philip didn't organize big events. He didn't seek crowds, but hearts came to him like moths to a flame. Meanwhile, the city whispered, "That priest is strange," some clergy murmured. "Too much joy, too much freedom." "That priest is crazy," others said. "He should act more serious." But the people, those who suffered, who wept in silence, who carried hidden sins, they loved him, because with Philip, they felt safe, forgiven, joyful. At times, to combat his own vanity, Philip did unusual penances. He would shave only half his beard, walk around in a ridiculous tunic, publicly kiss a stray dog, and when someone asked why, he would answer, "Because pride can't stand being laughed at. And I, my brother, am far more vain than I look." But at night, when the city slept, Philip returned to his cell. There, alone with God, he wept. He wept out of love, exhaustion, longing for everyone to know Christ's tenderness. Sometimes he spent hours in ecstasy. His body would levitate, his face would glow, and his heart would beat like a heavenly drum. The brothers would find him surrounded by light, his arms stretched wide like on the cross. "Father, are you all right?" they asked. And barely waking, he would whisper, "God is so near." In Rome, they were already beginning to speak of him as a saint. Some said he had visions, others that he worked miracles. Philip simply smiled. "The only miraculous thing about me," he would say, "is that I haven't landed in hell yet." This was how Philip lived, the priest of joy, without titles, without power, without fame, but with a fire in his chest that burned him from within, and with one clear mission, to lead souls to God, smiling, because to him holiness was so serious it could only be lived with laughter. Rome could no longer ignore him. The name of Philip Neri began to spread from mouth to mouth. Like a strange story, no one knew if it was legend or miracle. In the Vatican hallways, cardinals asked about the priest who made people laugh, while the beggars by the Tiber spoke of the father who hugged without asking questions. The heart of the city beat differently, and at the center was that man with a light step and a blazing soul. But Philip wasn't seeking fame. In fact, he fled from it as if it were the devil himself. When the bishops wanted to make him a cardinal, he hid behind a curtain and only came out when they left. When the Pope wanted to name him a prelate, he faked madness so convincingly that the messenger left believing Philip had lost his mind. "Why don't you accept these honors, Father?" a young priest asked him. "Because the higher you climb, the farther you fall," I prefer to stay low, where if I trip, I only get my sandals dirty." Yet, in his humility, God kept pushing him forward. The Oratory, that little room where young people gathered to sing psalms and read the lives of the saints, was no longer big enough. The walls couldn't contain the grace spilling out. More and more souls came, not just children and prostitutes, but nobles, artists, musicians, scholars, even cardinals. Everyone sat in a circle, without hierarchies. Everyone read, prayed, sang, shared. Everyone was a child. "Father, does what we do here have a name?" one of the faithful asked. "Yes," Philip answered with a gentle smile. "It's called loving God with joy." Thus, the congregation of the Oratory was born. Not with decrees or solemn foundations, it was born like all living things, organically through human warmth, through freedom and tenderness. Philip never wanted vows or rigid rules. He only asked the priests to live together as brothers without private property, under one simple rule: charity and joy. The first Oratorians were a mosaic, some young, others old, some scholars, others simple, some sick, others fiery. But all were drawn by the invisible flame burning in their founder's heart. Among them were Cesare Baronio, who would become a cardinal and church historian, Francesco Maria Tarughi, future Archbishop of Avignon, and many others, anonymous but silent pillars of the Catholic Reformation. The congregation settled in the Church of Santa Maria in Vallicella, restored with the help of many benefactors touched by grace. Philip didn't want anything ostentatious. When they showed him a gilded altar, he'd say, "Better give that to the poor. Jesus already has enough gold in heaven." But he did promote spiritual beauty, good music, well-prepared liturgies, art that lifted the soul. He attracted composers like Palestrina, and the Oratory's chants echoed through the Roman streets like whispers from paradise. "Music," he would say, "is like incense for the soul. It rises, perfumes, and makes God smile." At the Oratory, there were no endless sermons or theatrical penances, just heart, just truth, just love. The poor found comfort, the young found direction, the wise found humility. No one left the same as they arrived. Yet not everything was roses. There was opposition. Many churchmen distrusted so much disorder. A community without vows? A founder who laughed, who didn't punish, who allowed jokes between sacred readings. Some even accused him of heresy. The Inquisition kept a close watch. He was called in to testify. Philip went, walking slowly, head bowed. They questioned him. "Is it true you tell young people that God doesn't get angry?" And he answered, "It's easier to convert a heart with a caress than with a stick." The accusations were dropped. They found nothing against him. They only left him with a warning: "Be prudent, Father Neri." And as he left, Philip quietly said, "I'll be prudent, but I won't stop being happy." So, amid suspicion, slander, and praise, the congregation of the Oratory flourished, not as a powerful order, but as a family of fire. A fire that didn't burn, but transformed. The Oratorians lived without pomp. They ate together, prayed together, served together. Philip corrected them with tenderness, and sometimes with humor. Once one of them became arrogant after giving a successful sermon. The next day, Philip ordered him to preach on Balaam's donkey. The young priest obeyed, sweated, stumbled over his words, and afterward, Philip whispered in his ear, "The donkey spoke again, but this time it said nothing useful." And they both laughed. That's how he taught, firmly yes, but always with mercy. The congregation of the Oratory wasn't just an institution, it was a silent revolution. In a time of religious wars, heresies, and counter-reforms, Philip created an oasis, a place where one could be holy and human, a place where faith wasn't terror, but tenderness, where holiness wasn't unreachable, but everyday, where God's love wasn't imposed, but offered like a feast. And at the center of it all, an old man with a joyful face, eyes ablaze, and a heart beating like a sacred drum. A heart that no longer fit inside his chest. The rumors were constant. In the piazzas, in the sacristies, in the cobbled streets winding through Trastevere, everyone was whispering, "Have you been to the Oratory yet? Have you seen the priest who makes you cry and laugh in the same confession? They say even the cardinals stand in line to see him." Philip Neri, the apostle of joy, had become, without wanting it, the beating heart of a Rome desperately in need of conversion. Not with power, not with speeches, not with institutional reforms, but with the invisible fire of the Holy Spirit. That fire which burns without consuming, which warms without scorching. Every morning, even before the sun touched the domes of the city, Philip rose. He celebrated Mass, trembling with love. Sometimes, the trembling was so strong he had to stop, resting his head on the altar as silent tears fell onto the corporal cloth. "Are you sick, Father?" a young altar server once asked. "No, son," he answered, his voice shaking. "It's just that God is so sweet." After Mass, he sat for hours in the confessional. Everyone came, merchants, soldiers, prostitutes, noble women, confused monks, restless artists. Some came out of curiosity, others out of despair, but nearly all left transformed. "What do you say to them, Father?" an intrigued bishop once asked. "Nothing new," Philip smiled softly. "I just show them that Jesus still has his arms open." One of Philip's greatest miracles was making the great become small. Some of Rome's most powerful figures came to him in secret, confessing their miseries, their doubts, their hidden sins. "Philip," a cardinal once said through tears, "I've lived as if God were just an idea, and you've made me remember he's a person." "Not me, Your Eminence." Philip gently placed a hand over his chest. "Him. Always him." In a Rome wounded by empty splendor and superstition, the Oratory became a refuge. Souls knew they were welcomed, not judged. Philip embraced them with tenderness, but he also shook them with truth. A young noblewoman, devoted to worldly vanities, once came seeking a blessing. She wore elegant gowns, glittering jewels, and expensive perfume filled the air. "Do you want to save your soul, daughter?" Philip asked her. "Yes, Father," she replied, more out of politeness than conviction. "Then, start by taking off that corset of pride, and then come pray with me barefoot." Perplexed, she hesitated. But when she looked into the old man's eyes, filled with sincere love, she agreed. That night, she wept like a child. Days later, she sold her jewels and gave the proceeds to the poor. Philip didn't perform grand, spectacular miracles, but hearts were changing, and that was the greatest miracle of all. The entire city began to shift. Tavern fights lessened. Religious processions felt more heartfelt. Young people spent less time loitering in the streets and more time at the Oratory. And the poor, oh the poor. At last they had a place where they were not despised, but honored as God's favorites. Philip roamed the streets with a pouch hidden under his cassock, where he kept alms to quietly distribute. Sometimes, when he found an old man sleeping on the street, he'd kneel beside him, cover the man's feet with his own mantle and whisper, "Forgive me, brother, for arriving late." Then he would move on. Quiet. Burning. Pope Gregory XIII summoned him for advice. He sought Philip's counsel, yet Philip refused every position of power. When the Pope wanted to name him bishop, Philip fell at his feet and pleaded, "Your Holiness, don't take away my freedom or my holy foolishness." And the Pope, smiling, relented. Once during a confession, a young man asked him, "Father, how can you bear so much sin every day?" And Philip replied, "Because every confessed sin is one less stone on Christ's back and one step closer to his embrace." Philip had the ability to see souls, not through divination, but through love. Sometimes he knew, without being told, what someone was hiding, but he never used that gift to humiliate, only to heal. One night, a man stormed into the oratory, shouting, insulting, spitting. Everyone fell silent. Philip, calm, approached. He reached out his hand and said, "It hurts, doesn't it?" The man, bewildered, broke into tears. He fell to his knees, and there, in the midst of the silence, found a God who had never spoken to him so clearly. The fire kept burning, and the city, without fully realizing it, was being evangelized, not with crusades, but with caresses. Philip Neri, God's fool, the saint with the expanded heart, was transforming Rome, not with new doctrines, not with structures, but with a single invincible force: love. A love that laughed, that wept, that forgave, that embraced. And that set everything ablaze. The eternal city aged slowly under the footsteps of the 16th century. The golden domes of Rome still gleamed in the sunlight, but something deeper had shifted. The laughter of the gospel was no longer a distant echo. Thanks to Philip, it now rang out during confessions, in the psalms of the Oratory, in streets where once only indifference reigned. And yet, the radiant old man was beginning to lean under the weight of his years. Philip was over 80. His small, stooped body seemed held upright only by the force of the heart inside him. A heart enlarged, physically deformed by the invisible fire of divine love, beating with an intensity no doctor could explain. "Father," his fellow Oratorians would tell him gently, "why don't you rest? You've done enough." And he, smiling with tender mischief, would reply, "Rest? Does love ever grow tired?" Each morning, he still rose before dawn. He continued to celebrate Mass, though at times he needed help just to stand. He kept hearing confessions for hours, his voice trembling but his gaze steady. He continued carrying the sorrows of all who came to him, because they were his own. But the flame, though never dimming, began to flicker. Not for lack of ardor, but because the lamp was wearing out. One night, returning to his cell, he felt a deep pain in his chest. It was not new. He knew it well. He welcomed it like one recognizes a long-awaited visitor. "You're coming, aren't you?" he whispered, gazing up through the small window toward the sky. His hands trembled. His body, exhausted from years of service, seemed ready to yield. But his soul was more alive than ever. The brothers of the Oratory, worried, called a doctor. After examining him, the doctor murmured, "His heart beats as if it's on fire inside. I don't understand how he's still alive." "I do," one of the brothers said softly. "It's because he has never stopped loving." In the final days of May, Philip knew the end was near. He did not fear it. He longed for it. He spoke with even more sweetness than usual. He said his goodbyes with gestures, with glances, with silences that spoke more than 1,000 sermons. On May 25, 1595, he celebrated his last Mass. It took him more than an hour to say just a few words, because every phrase brought him to tears. When he received communion, he remained still, eyes closed, as if heaven had opened for him one last time. That night, he withdrew to his cell. A small oil lamp flickered on the table. Philip lay down on his bed. He had nothing, only a cross, an old tunic, and a heart that no longer fit inside his body. He called his closest companions, taking their hands one by one. "Do not be sad," he told them softly. "Where I am going, the joy never ends." They asked if he wanted anything. "Yes," he answered with a smile. "Pray, and never stop laughing." At midnight, his face lit up. His lips moved silently. He was saying something, perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a laugh only heaven could understand. Then, slowly, his chest rose for the last time, and it stopped. Philip had departed. The news spread across Rome like a silent flash of lightning. The city fell still. There were no bells, only tears. People of every class flocked to Santa Maria in Vallicella, nobles and beggars, theologians and prostitutes, children and the elderly. All wanted to see him one last time, to touch him, to thank him. "Why are you crying?" a child asked his mother. "Because Father Philip taught us how to love, and now he's gone. And who will make us laugh now?" She didn't know how to answer. His body was examined by papal order. What they found confirmed what many had suspected. His heart, physically enlarged, had displaced 2 ribs. He had lived with a real burning fire inside him, literally. His heart, a doctor whispered, was not human. Or not only human. When the Pope heard the details, he knelt privately and said, "Rome has lost a priest, and heaven has gained a son." But it wasn't true. Rome had not lost him. Because fire does not disappear. It spreads. The oratory continued. His disciples followed in his footsteps. People kept coming. The spirit of Philip Neri, light, joyful, tireless, floated through the streets of Rome, not like a ghost, but like a flame passing from soul to soul. And so, the sunset of his life was not a darkness, but a dawn, an eternal dawn. There are saints who build monasteries, write great treatises, combat heresies, or found religious orders that cross oceans. And then there is Philip Neri, the saint who left no grand books, no armor, no towering walls, but smiles. Philip didn't change the world with swords or papal decrees, but with simple laughter, a gaze full of tenderness, a heart that beat more for others than for himself. In a Rome shaken by the shadows of the Reformation, the excesses of the Counter-Reformation, and deep institutional distrust, he chose the weakest path, and therefore the strongest one. Invisible charity, daily humility, quiet joy that disarms without wounding. They called him the Saint of Joy, but he was more than that. He was the man who turned joy into a form of prayer, a mystical path, a secret sacrament that required no altar, only an open soul. His congregation of the Oratory didn't conquer continents, but it conquered hearts. No vows, no rigid hierarchies, no oppressive structures, only the fire of the Spirit, interior freedom and brotherhood without masks. And there, in that small corner of Rome, was born a movement that continues to ignite souls more than 4 centuries later. Philip was canonized in 1622, but his holiness needed no decree. He carried it in the way he walked, in how he listened, in how he touched each person as if they were the only one in the world. He was a counselor to popes and a confessor to prostitutes, a father to scholars and a friend to beggars, a healer of souls and a jester of himself. He used to say that anyone who doesn't laugh at themselves risks mistaking themselves for God, and that a well-timed laugh can open more doors than 1,000 sermons. Today, Philip Neri still walks among us. In every priest who listens with tenderness, in every mother who comforts without judgment, in every young person who serves quietly, in every Christian who remembers that the kingdom of God also takes the shape of a smile. His life is a blazing reminder that holiness is not made of marble or titles or empty solemnity. It is a dance with God. A dance with dusty feet, worn hands, and a heart bursting with love. Because when a soul truly loves, it can no longer contain itself. And then it overflows. It becomes flame. It becomes light. It becomes life for others, just like the heart of Philip. A heart that never stopped beating. Saint Philip Neri, Father of Joy, Apostle of Rome, heart without borders, pray for us.